Is it over? It's over. I think it's over at last. So last week, the WHO finally downgraded the global health emergency from COVID-19. So after those crazy 3 years, maybe 2 for most of us, but certainly 3 for the planet, all that disruption, the sheltering, the lockdowns, all what's happened in society, people, individuals, businesses, it's all over. And the question is where to from here, from consumer point of view, from a society point of view, from a brand connection point of view, what does it all mean? So today I want to talk about repressed trauma, unprocessed trauma, and PTSD. Because I actually think that societally, everybody in the planet, every customer of yours is actually going through PTSD. So to kind of rewind, let's talk about trauma first, and what trauma actually is. So, lots of definitions from the psychology literature, but ultimately trauma is where your safety is threatened, often a life-threatening event. So you got things like acts of war and violence, domestic abuse, emotional abuse, even natural disasters. And in fact, you can have a traumatic event and you don't even have to experience it yourself. You can just witness that traumatic event and it can affect you. So trauma everywhere, and certainly the pandemic is a traumatic event. It was a life-threatening event. It was also not a short-term event. Trauma can be a once-off thing, but can also be a continuous thing. And of course, it certainly was for us. The vaccine uncertainty stretched out for many, many months and years, and it became wave after wave after wave in terms of trauma. So everybody in society, including you were exposed to a life-threatening trauma, and it was even magnified by the social isolation, the social disruption, businesses closing, not access to services and products that you were used to. And so it was a very unusual time. So we have to acknowledge that we all went through a significantly traumatic event, and that's interesting because most people don't actually acknowledge that. So the next thing is, if we go through trauma, often some people suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what's interesting is that some people can go through a traumatic event, and given time, usually a month or 2, the body restores that sense of alarm back to homeostasis and they continue on with their lives. Whereas others exposed to the exact same traumatic event suffer from PTSD. And it's curious as to why some people do and some people don't. And so it can be simply to do with previous trauma that you're exposed to, your age, your chemical hormone makeup of your brain, inherited mental disorders from previous genetics. There's so many factors that can affect PTSD. So, and then again, they're all in the literature. But what I'm interested in is, are we going through PTSD as a whole, as a society? All the consumers, all the brands trying to connect to those consumers. What can we learn from PTSD, and how can we help our customers and our employees? So let's look at kind of the 4 main key areas of PTSD. So the first one, in terms of the effects of PTSD, is intrusive thoughts. So often when you go through a traumatic event, you can have these intrusive thoughts that come back again and again in your conscious life or in your dreams, and the traumatic event is replayed and replayed. And we don't seem to have a huge amount of that actually in society right now. I know some frontline healthcare workers certainly get those kind of flashbacks because it was such a traumatic, particularly the first 6 months for them. But that's isolated to that unique area of expertise. I think society as a whole, we're not going through that. What we are going through is changes to how we think. And so the second one in terms of PTSD is changes in how you think, in your mood. And that kind of sense of hopelessness that creeps in. There's a sense of emotional numbness, and that's a very obvious PTSD reaction. Now that is evident in society. There's definitely, from a Great Resignation point of view, all the labor issues we're having in terms of employee experience. There definitely is a productivity issue, a numbness issue, a kind of a hopelessness issue for some people. They're kind of uncertain as to where to go from here, and that is evident in a PTSD reaction. The third one in terms of PTSD is changes in physical or emotional mood. And again, that is very evident in society in terms of sleep hygiene, tiredness. So a lot of people are nowhere near as productive as they used to be pre-pandemic. And people are blaming it on various things, on the vaccine, on long COVID, on just working from home, on changes. But also some of this is just PTSD, this disruption to sleep schedules, insomnia, and also things like anxiety, suicidal thoughts, depression are all off the charts, of course, globally, everywhere. And we have to acknowledge that a large part of that is what we all went through societally. But the fourth one I really want to talk about, the fourth one, which is really evident to me at a societal scale and a classic PTSD reaction, is avoidance. So when you go through trauma, you tend to try and avoid any memory of that trauma because you don't want to be re-triggered. And so there's 2 kind of ways that the human brain handles that trauma and represses that trauma. and it's in this avoidance sphere. One is the unconscious mind theory, and this is very much influenced by Freud's work. So this is the idea that, you know, the brain, in order to survive, squashes down the memory, moves the memory away from conscious thought. And so it's a very unconscious thing. And it was really evident, for instance, in the clerical abuse scandals, where as people came forward and saying that they had been abused, other people were having flashbacks that went back 30, 40 years and thought, oh my God, me too. They had actually completely repressed that memory unconsciously in order to survive, in order to cope. And then there's the other side of the psychology literature that talks about conscious repression. And that's where we are as a society post-traumatic stress. It's about this thing happened, but let's not think about it. Let's just move on. And that's really the attitude every customer and every employee I meet has. It's kind of, look, that happened. Yeah, it happened. Let's just move on. Let's kind of not deal with it. Let's just forget about it. Let's move on. And that's the subject area that I'm really interested in, this repressed trauma, conscious repression. And we all know what happens, unfortunately, when you repress, when you unprocess or repress trauma, you bury it away. Obviously, it's going to come back up. It's going to come back up and come out in some form. In terms of behaviors. And so what I'm conscious of here is the effect this may have on our customer connections and our employee connections. And so there's three things I think that we need to help our customers with and our employees with as brands and businesses in order to cope with this PTSD and cope with this repressed trauma and avoidance. The first one, I think, is don't be a trigger. So don't be a pandemic trigger. And everywhere at the moment I go, sometimes into retail spaces, you still catch the odd floor sticker, please keep distant. You see the sanitized station. Some places still have those big perspex screens between you and the customer. And so my advice to you if you have a business is if you feel it's safe to do so, obviously, remove those perspex screens. Make sure you don't have any of those COVID signs or stickers or masks. And you see it every now and then in airports and hotels. Some restaurants still use those QR scanning codes for menus. They're still not giving out menus because it's kind of easier for them. But don't be triggering those memories, because every time you trigger that memory of, oh, this is what it was like in those times, it's a negative connection, and you're creating negative connections to do with your positive brand experience. So go through your customer journey, go through every aspect of your business, try and find the places where maybe there and websites, a lot of websites are still old, especially small business websites, still referring to the pandemic and ways to book, and get rid of all those. Get rid of any trigger that reminds people of the trauma they don't want to be reminded. The second one is don't be a pandemic brand. Really interesting. Some brands, of course, used the pandemic to better connect with customers, which was a wonderful thing. Customers were vulnerable, they were worried, they were scared, and so it was a great time to connect. Unfortunately, if you made really positive connections during the pandemic, your brand can be associated with that negative thing. And now you're intertwined with a negative experience. So I had a wonderful example recently where a friend of mine was using a meal subscription box. So every single week the box arrives, she takes all the food out for her family of 4. A really convenient product. But she used that brand and product for the first time during the pandemic because the supermarkets had huge queues to get into. It was difficult to feed a family of 4, social isolation. So she started to use this wonderful meal subscription product. She told me recently that she has recently changed providers of that product because every time the box arrived with their logo on it, the logo made her feel a bit icky. The logo made her feel remembering those hard times, those stressful times, those worried times, and that logo got mixed up with those sentiments, and that's how she feels now every time the logo enters her house. So she has made the decision to move brand to a different provider to not have that feeling. Now, she was able to consciously say that to me because I was kind of exploring it with her, but most customers wouldn't be able to verbalize that. So have a think, if you had a very good connections with customers during the pandemic, maybe have a think about doing a little brand refresh, changing some logo colors, maybe a full brand refresh, just to make sure that you don't get trapped in that pandemic brand space. And the third one I want to talk about is support, connection, and care. Because if anyone's going through PTSD, if any of your friends or colleagues are going through PTSD right now with another traumatic event, you would be there for them, wouldn't you? So remember, as brands and businesses, we were there for our customers all through the pandemic. But a bit like a runner doing a race, you're coming to the end of the tape and you slow down because you think, well, you won the race. And just when you do that, someone else goes by and wins it instead. I think that's where we are. We're kind of saying, well, it's all back to normal now, let's just do business. No. Because actually the customer is going through significant PTSD. They just don't even know it themselves. They're not acknowledging it. So we have to be there to care, to support, and that goes for your employees too. Employee experience and CX and EX. These are the two most common things I'm asked to talk about on the circuit today because they are the issues that are at the heart of everything. So, if your customer is irate, is angry, has unrealistic expectations. These are all normal because they're going through PTSD. So treat them like you would a tired child. Be gentle with them. Remember that they're going through hard times. Similarly with your employees, productivity is low, creativity, innovation, they're all suffering. Why? It's because people are fatigued, people are a bit hopeless, they're a bit numb. So we have to allow it, but also help them. We have to step up and help them. Better connections with employees, better investment in employee experience, better connection with customers, and just understand that their demands on us are going to be a little bit out of whack for a while, simply because they're going through that PTSD, and we have to be there to help, to support. There's lots of other videos on my channel from 2020 and 2021 about the psychology of recovery. Maybe worth the look back, because actually that's where we still are. We're in recovery of this pandemic. We're in the whole, as a society, we're in this kind of avoidance spell. I mean, look at it this way. When the WHO announced that the global pandemic emergency was finished, there wasn't actually a big celebration all over the world, because we've all kind of past it. We all want to forget about it. And so that's a classic example of PTSD. So have a think about how you can better connect with customers. Don't be a pandemic brand. Don't trigger any of the trauma and the negativity around it. But be aware that the employee and the customer both just need a little bit of guidance and support. Still, even though the pandemic is over, we're all going through PTSD. Until next time, wish you well.